What up, everybody? It's Frank Muller, back at it again with another video today. You're watching Level Up, Double Down, where we don't play around unless it's video games. Now, if you like the type of content I make and you want to see more, like the video and subscribe to the channel. I hope I can earn your support today. So with that out the way, let's go ahead and get things started. Now, in today's episode, I just wanted to chime in and share my thoughts on a recent interview from Jensen Huang, head honcho at NVIDIA, who was recently on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast on December 4, 2025. I took the time to watch it in its entirety twice for almost 2.5 hours each time, just so I could give you the cliff notes and insights regarding my own interpretation, impressions, and opinions as to what had transpired. So for those of you who haven't watched it yet, I would recommend you check it out. Just to bring the audience up to speed for those of you who don't know this man, Jensen Huang is one of the co-founders of NVIDIA, which is a computer graphics company with the current $5 trillion market cap. But nowadays, the company has pivoted their technological advancements and development more towards prioritizing AI for the business sector rather than attracting the average consumer for obvious reasons. Keep that in mind as I expound on AI throughout this video. Regardless of how you feel about this man, speaking for myself, when a person whose skills I want to emulate speaks, I think that's when it's the perfect time to listen, so that's what I did. So here are my main takeaways from that interview, which are not in any particular order as they came up during the interview, but rather they are things that stood out to me, which I thought would be interesting to share. So after they both got their small talk and pleasantries out the way, that's when we were able to finally get some substantive information as it relates to Jensen's mindset on the current state of AI. One thing of note, I found it comical that Jensen really tried to prop up AI as an everyday utility that the average person uses.
People use AI so much today is because the amount of hallucination has reduced. You know, I use it I used it the whole trip over here.
Claiming that he used it throughout his whole trip on his way to seeing Joe. Oh my God, this dude was on Trump's dick so damn hard, glazing him whenever he got the chance to, describing him in words of flattery, calling him a good listener and claiming he remembers everything, which is ironic considering Trump is almost 80 years old, which is neither here nor there. However, I will agree with Jensen's sentiment pertaining to Trump's appeal, which is Trump says what's on his mind.
You know, part of his charm, part of his genius is just he says what's on his mind.
Jensen was all of a sudden America first and caring about national security, even though he's currently selling AI chips to China, which is a competing nation for AI dominance.
Without energy growth, we can have no industrial growth.
Now, without energy growth, we cannot have industrial growth. The famous words of a wise man. At that moment, he might as well have been an impromptu Trump PR rep. By the way, he was complimenting Trump regarding his leadership and his desire to bring back manufacturing onshore. I will say though, Jensen sure does know how to tell people what they want to hear just to get what he wants out of them.
Well, they're thinking somehow that this AI is being powerful, and their mind probably goes towards a sci-fi movie.
At this point of the interview, I can commend Jensen for acknowledging what most people's concerns are for how powerful they perceive AI is becoming to the point where it can threaten the human race, referencing sci-fi movies. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the Terminator movie series.
It's extremely unlikely.
Yeah, that's what they said in the Terminator movie.
And it hasn't happened.
No, not yet, but you guys are working towards it.
But I digress. However, Joe then clarified specifically that he's speaking in reference to the military-industrial complex as it pertains to how warmongering neocons want to capitalize on AI by integrating it into military applications and operations, essentially delegating the decision of judge, jury, and executioner to AI, which most people with the soul would consider unconscionable. Jensen actually doubles down on his support for the U.S. military's use of AI technology for defense, stating that military might is a deterrent to prevent war. I can respect Jensen's opinion for saying what he thinks, but not necessarily the morality behind it.
That's a big issue with people, is the worry that technology is going to get to a point where encryption is going to be obsolete. encryption is just, it's no longer going to protect data. It's no longer going to protect systems.
Shout out to Joe for bringing up a critical talking point about the viability of encryption and how its purpose may become futile as AI technology becomes more powerful, essentially meaning that the passwords you create could become penetrable and perceptible by AI without much effort. Jensen's response was that he has faith in the cybersecurity community to work together to combat such a threat, but I don't foresee such a likelihood of that happening, but I could be wrong.
I think the quantum computers were supposed to, quantum computers will make it possible, will make it so that the previous encryption technology is obsolete.
Now, quantum computing has been a buzzword for quite a while, and it got my attention back in 2023 when I started noticing how there's a technological race to build quantum chips alongside making this technology closed source. And in this interview, Jensen theorizes that quantum computing will be the next evolutionary step in developing future encryption technology with a newer algorithm to boot. Jensen's reliance on history as a predicator for the outcome of theoretical upcoming events, I think, could be a potential oversight and his blind spot in a post-AI society. And I wholeheartedly agree with Joe that the gloves are off with the advent of AI becoming more prevalent, since AI can be unpredictable. Given the fear that AI could become sentient, meaning that it could independently make decisions and govern society how it sees fit. Jensen then makes a hypothetical claim that he'll have his own AI that would compete against another dissenting AI if he's ever confronted with such a threat, which I find off the wall and outlandish at the very least, because who's to say that these AIs aren't going to collab amongst each other for the common goal of human domination, theoretically speaking.
If it has no ego, why would it have the ego to do any harm to us?
Well, I don't assume that it would do harm to us, but the fear would be that we would no longer have control and that we would no longer be the apex species on the planet.
I don't know if Jensen was deliberately being naive to the concerns that Joe was making, but I'm pretty sure Jensen knows better, since Joe's argument isn't that humans fear AI will harm them, but rather they fear that humans may no longer control AI due to its insistence to no longer listen to humans and therefore operate on its own terms. And to Joe's point, when he brought up a story to Jensen about some AI researchers who made up a fake scenario to present to the AI by pretending that one of the researchers was cheating on their wife, the AI threatened to expose the affair to the researcher's wife when they tried to shut it down. But Jensen only wanted to deduce that down to the AI's mimicry of human patterns and behavior, while discrediting it as not being any sort of consciousness, while calling it an imitation of consciousness.
It seems like it's a version of a kind of consciousness.
It's a version of imitation.
Imitation consciousness, right. But if it perfectly imitates it.
I still think it's an example of imitation.
Which I thought was making light of the situation. Let me ask you this. Imagine if 90% of the world's knowledge was generated by AI. That sounds like a bleak future in my opinion.
In the future, in a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, 90% of the world's knowledge will likely be generated by AI.
That's crazy.
Something that caught my attention regarding a habit that Jensen would employ, for the lack of a better word, was that whenever Joe would bring up a concern that could be defined as an existential threat, Jensen would deflect and adjust his answer to the question by putting a positive spin to his response. Simply speaking, he would downplay any doom or gloom scenario in order to take the sting out of the question. This was something I noticed Jensen would do throughout the entire interview, and I'm not sure if anybody else caught on to that.
And I think a lot of people have a problem with that, because their entire identity and how they think of themselves and how they fit in the community is what they do. Like, this is Mike. He's an amazing mechanic. Go to Mike, and Mike takes care of things. But there's going to come a point in time where AI is going to be able to do all those things much better than people do. And people will just be able to receive money. But then what does Mike do?
Whenever Joe would ask Jensen tough questions by bringing up the AI race and prefacing how the implementation of AI in a company's business operations was causing redundancies leading up to people's jobs getting taken, and inquiring what were people going to do for work since their self-identity was tied to the line of work that they did, Jensen does this thing where he'll bring up an example that's almost mostly unrelated to the situation that Joe was expounding on. Case in point, Jensen responds by generalizing that radiologists are using AI more than ever to accurately study x-rays and images to better diagnose the human condition. Contrary to what Jeff Hinton, the godfather of AI, had theorized, since Jeff was under the impression that the adoption of AI by radiologists would dramatically reduce the number of radiologists needed that are currently in the workforce. At this point, I felt that this was Jensen's attempt at trying to prove Hinton wrong, claiming that the purpose of radiologists is to diagnose the disease, not to necessarily study the images. And so Jensen tries to rephrase the question by asking, does AI change the purpose of the radiologist?
Ultimately, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of the lawyer? And has the purpose changed?
However, Joe's argument was in reference to the types of jobs that will get replaced by AI, with Jensen following up with, it will if your job is a task. But Jensen doesn't take into account that 80% of your low-skilled workers are going to be negatively impacted by AI, and then he tries to convince Joe of his utopian reality while looking at it through rosy-tinted glasses.
You are rosy about the future. You're very optimistic about what's going to happen with AI. How could everybody be wealthy, though? What
because
scenario?
Wealthy, not because you have a lot of dollars. Wealthy because there's a lot of abundance.
Jensen even has the audacity to say that because of how much revenue AI brings in, that everybody's going to become wealthy, which was very vague regarding the explanation to his statement, since that's far from the truth. And if that were the case, then the average person would be getting paid from AI right now. And to Jensen's argument, what the hell does abundance of knowledge have to do with someone being wealthy?
How, Sway? You ain't got the answers. You ain't got the answers, Sway.
If you know, you know. Talk about bullshitting your way through an interview when you're being confronted with the harsh reality. Laugh out loud. Now I felt that Jensen was a bit out of touch and disingenuous with his outlook for the future of the average American, especially when it came to how he was suggesting that AI would create more new jobs, which was counter to the fact that the current implementation of AI in the workflow of a number of Fortune 500 companies is causing the elimination of jobs without there being a valid replacement job for the displaced worker, and the creation of AI jobs would be disproportionate to the number of jobs that are already being lost. And I know the employers aren't obligated to provide people with a job, and I understand that people aren't entitled to have a job. So say for instance I was unemployed. Jensen suggested that someone in that type of situation could easily be trained on how AI functions in order to be fluent, qualified, and capable to run some sort of AI switchboard for employment, which was what he was referring to. But he simplified it as if AI as a whole wasn't complicated enough in its current form for people to understand right now.
Now, the reason why I believe AI is going to reduce the technology divide is because we have proof. The evidence is that AI is the easiest application in the world to use.
Joe also brought up a very good point regarding how AI is devastating certain communities when it comes to the lack of infrastructure, being that these newly built AI data centers require a lot of energy and resources, such as water and electricity, in order to operate, leaving the residents to hold the bag.
Almost everything is going to be energy constrained. And so if you take a look at one of the most important technology advances in history is this idea called Moore's Law.
In response, this dude Jensen brings up Moore's Law by stating that as time goes on, the amount of energy it takes to function a specific technology becomes less necessary, as if that has anything to do with what's happening right now to those people whose electric bills are skyrocketing out of control because these AI data centers are popping up all over the place. And to add insult to injury, Jensen then brings up the NVIDIA law, which sounds like something he pulled out of his ass, as if it's some type of philosophy where the science behind it offers some sort of real-world tangible benefit based on something NVIDIA produces in order to reduce the cost for consumers over time. What a bunch of bullshit.
In 2012, Jeff Hinton's lab, this gentleman I was talking about, Ilya Sutskever, Alex Kershevsky, they made a breakthrough in computer vision, in literally creating a piece of software called AlexNet
Now, what I will give Jensen credit for is how he eventually goes into detail regarding the breakthrough of a neural network called AlexNet with the use of NVIDIA GPUs and SLI to do deep learning and machine learning, being that NVIDIA GPUs could process things in parallel, contrary to a CPU, which could only do them individually in sequential order, and this is what sparked the modern AI boom. Another detail that stood out to me was the creation of the DGX-1 supercomputer, which contained 8 chips connected via NVLink, and NVIDIA sold it to Elon Musk for $300,000, only to bring things back home almost 10 years later with the creation of the DGX Spark, which was a miniature-sized version of the DGX-1, which NVIDIA gifted the first one off the assembly line to Elon.
By 2016, I had built this computer called the DGX-1. The one that you saw me give to Elon is called DGX Spark.
This whole backstory was something I was totally, completely unaware of, nor did I bother to do my research on it prior to listening to this interview.
When NVIDIA started in 1993, we were trying to create this new computing approach. The question is, what's the killer app?
At this point, Jensen actually starts going into further detail, elaborating on some of his backstory and the company history of NVIDIA, which I felt was not only immersive, but also intriguing to say the least. Back in 1993, before NVIDIA became a household name, they were trying to reinvent the wheel by approaching computer graphics from a different angle, outside of the current industry standards. Keep this in mind as I start to flesh out my summarization of Jensen's backstory. Now, this is where I thought Jensen shined during the interview. At this point, I came to admire his tenacity and drive to seek out goals that he had established for himself and the company by tackling problems, one of which involved 3D graphics applications. Jensen was so ecstatic about Sega's 3D graphics approach within their arcades at the time that he had devised a plan, which was to fly out to Japan and convince Sega to partner with NVIDIA, and Sega would port their games to the PC. In exchange, NVIDIA would build a chip for their upcoming game console, which was how NVIDIA got started.
In 1995, mid-95, we realized we were going down the wrong path. Meanwhile, the Silicon Valley was packed with 3D graphics startups because it was the most exciting technology of that time.
However, 2 years in, NVIDIA realized there was a major flaw in their rendering approach. What I mean by that is this: although their architecture concepts were sound, their approach to computer graphics was counterproductive to what the rest of the industry was doing. At that point, they realized they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, having to decide between whether or not they should backtrack and change course in order to right the ship, or stick to what they've been doing this whole time, which was the wrong way, while trying to figure things out. Jensen eventually decided not to go at it the wrong way any further, but another dilemma that was coming up was NVIDIA was running out of money and they owed Sega that chip for their upcoming game console, but they couldn't afford to not carry out the remainder of the contract since they needed the money, or that could spell the end of NVIDIA's existence. So Jensen swallowed his pride and flew to Japan and explained the whole situation to the current CEO at that time, Shoichiro Irimajiri, recommending Sega to go with a different company for their game console, while also confessing that he still needed the rest of the money as outlined in their contract, which was $5 million in total. Because Irimajiri took a liking to Jensen, he relented, and after NVIDIA went public, as in an IPO, they went to pay back Sega, and Sega would receive an ROI, which was $15 million and was threefold their initial investment. The unfortunate outcome from all of this was Jensen had to lay off the employees who were part of the R&D for the game console, since that was a bust. But as a CEO, those are the type of tough decisions you'll have to make when you have an essential crisis that you're up against. After all the layoffs, the researchers that were left were unfamiliar with how to do things the right way. Luckily for NVIDIA, Silicon Graphics, one of their competitors in the 3D graphics application space, put together a textbook. So Jensen went to the bookstore and purchased the last 3 copies they had left, and then he gave it to 3 of those architects so they could study up on it in order to save the company.
Luckily, there was a textbook written by the company Silicon Graphics. And so I went down to the store. I had $200 in my pocket, and I bought 3 textbooks, the only 3 they had.
One thing I noticed is Jensen has a tendency to get on people's good side by complimenting their attributes when he engages with them. While they weren't necessarily surface level attributes, it's a skill that I actually read about in this book by Dan Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People. So I'm not even mad at Jensen for approaching people in his manner. If you know, you know. Now, Jensen refers to a product developed by NVIDIA before GeForce, which was called the Riva 128, which is what he insists really saved the company, and it was their first graphics processing unit for 3D gaming, which revolutionized computer graphics by offering hardware acceleration per his claims. Now, I'm not that quite familiar with the lore surrounding NVIDIA, but the upbringing was quite the come-up story based on what Jensen had to say so far. What else amazed me was Jensen's ingenuity at being able to bypass the taping out process while still being able to software test a chip made from silicon they had designed, and for what I could understand, they used what he called an emulator, which was a machine that they had configured with the specifications of their chip's design, and that machine would then pretend to be their chip, which saved NVIDIA a lot of time and money in the long run because they didn't have the budget for the tape out of their chip design and to send it to the fab since they were still operating on that $5 million advance that Sega gave them, which was decreasing by the day. But also, they were trying to ship their product out to market and they had a deadline to meet, so having to tape out a chip before sending it out to the fab and then wait however long it took before receiving the chip back from the foundry in order to do testing wasn't an efficient use of their time due to all the time they would have to wait. So having the ability to do all the necessary testing prior to having their tape out of the chip in order to send to the foundry was a lifesaver, according to Jensen. I can also commend Jensen for having the confidence to bet on himself because all NVIDIA had left was $1 million to their name at the time, so he took half of that money and he spent it on that emulator machine, which came from a company called ICOS, but they eventually went out of business after NVIDIA made the purchase of that machine. That's what you call going for broke. But what was clear to me during Jensen's interview was his salesmanship. It's a skill that's hard to come by, but it was very effective during his interactions with other companies who possessed the resources he needed to help his company stay alive. Speaking of which, he references a foundry called TSMC, which most people know of today, and he specifically name drops the CEO at that time, Morris Chang, for having faith in him regarding what he was trying to do. However, it did help that Jensen was an effective communicator, being able to express his ideas, form partnerships with those who he had did business with that lasted well into the future, develop a winning strategy, and create his own niche in the consumer market and deal with crisis management.
We created the modern 3D gaming market. We learned how, and so that exact same skill is how we created the modern AI market.
Jensen operated his business like there was no tomorrow, as if NVIDIA was going out of business in less than a month. So he was very cognizant about waste while being mindful about how much money they were spending. And to bring things full circle, the testing methodology that involved using the emulator machine like the one NVIDIA had would become industry standard and is still being utilized worldwide to this day. So here are a couple of nuggets I took away from some of the statements Jensen made in passing that I'm paraphrasing, which I would consider a winning formula to succeed as a CEO long term. Admit fault and be honest where you came at wrong. Be reasonable. Understand the basics and fundamentals based on what you do, that being your line of work. Understand why certain events occur based on that knowledge. Constantly reassess the situation as things progress. Be competent in what you do or possess some type of skill. And last but not least, don't get fired and don't get bored. Surround yourself around amazing people or people who have your best interest at heart, people who are embedded in your success as much as you are theirs. You don't necessarily have to be the smartest person in the room as a CEO, but having the ability to lean on others who have the intellect and know-how to accomplish tasks outside of your scope while following your lead, that is a skill that very few people possess. Matter of fact, one thing of note Jensen mentioned was that he always has to stay clued in on market trends without missing a beat in order to not get left behind. Part of that is attributed to the partnerships he's been able to foster with a number of universities and scientists across the country over the years and carry out collaborations with people outside of NVIDIA. And there's a number of industries under NVIDIA's belt that they service so they can never run out of customers. Jensen has cultivated a company culture that not only innovates new ideas, but they uplift each other to rise above their competition, and he still works even when he's on vacation. He's even passed on his work ethic down to his children who also work at NVIDIA currently. Something else I didn't know was NVIDIA provides a state-of-the-art research facility to their research scientists who not only are devoted to their job, but they consider computer science research their life's work. And since he's able to sufficiently provide them with enough resources to help support the company's mission, their loyalty to the company has been a byproduct of that. Jensen's personal background interested me as well. Around 1974, when Jensen was about 9 years old, he immigrated to America after his parents dropped off him and his 11-year-old brother with their uncle in Tacoma, Washington, due to there being civil unrest in Thailand where he was staying at the time, and his parents didn't think it was a good idea for kids to be there. Being from Taiwan, Jensen was able to speak good enough English, but he still had to get an education, so his uncle scoured the country in an effort to locate a school for him and his brother to go to that accepted foreigners, and his uncle came across Juanita Baptist Institute in Juanita, Kentucky, which could be considered an alternative school since they also accepted students who came from troubled homes. The first day Jensen showed up, he was welcomed by his roommate, who turned 17 years old, and the dorm he resided in had no closet doors or drawers, so it made it easy for staff to check in and monitor their activities, which Jensen compares to prison. Although Jensen was too young to attend Juanita Baptist since it was a junior high, he did attend the nearby elementary school, which required him to walk a mile past the Kentucky River, and he was allowed to reside at the dorm since his older brother attended school there. In order to live at the dorms, Jensen was assigned chores which involved him doing janitorial cleanup at the dorm while his older brother worked at the tobacco farms, which brought in extra money to support the school, and once again, Jensen compares it to prison. I don't know how true the outlandish claims he made were about everybody carrying a knife, everybody smoking, etc., but I don't see any reason why he would make that up. One touching comment he made was regarding his parents being too poor to afford to make international phone calls to check in on them, so as a result, his parents provided him with a tape deck with a tape so both him and his brother could record everything that went on for a whole month before they would ship it off to their parents, and in turn, his parents would record over that tape and repeat the process, and that would go on for 2 years straight. Even though that was the only way they could communicate with each other, they made the best of what they had. Jensen kept himself busy, staying in shape while living at the dorm. He joined both the soccer and swim team because they would take you to meets, and after those meets, they would go to a nice restaurant. But here's the kicker, that restaurant was McDonald's. I found it ironic how someone like Jensen, who came from a third world country, had more appreciation for a fast food restaurant that your average American takes for granted. Something to think about. However, Jensen would eventually meet his parents in Tacoma, Washington 2 years later, and when his parents arrived in America, they were almost penniless with nothing else but their suitcases. To put things into perspective, Jensen recounts an incident that occurred. When his family were living in an apartment, him and his brother were horseplaying around, and they ended up destroying a table that his parents were renting that was made out of particle board, and they couldn't afford nor did they know how they were going to pay for it, which demonstrated how destitute his parents were. And his parents went through all that just to pursue the American dream. I wholeheartedly think that a lot of people born in America have no clue how fortunate they are, since it's an opportunity that most people take for granted. His parents would eventually find their footing with his dad locking down an engineering job by responding to an ad in the newspaper, while his mom found a job as a maid. With all that being said, I think that going through adversity helps build character as well as toughens you up in order to prepare you for what potential dilemmas may lie in your wake. Something else that I gathered from Jensen was that if your fear of failure is what motivates you, then you will always stay in business. What I mean by that is this. You don't want to become the most successful company and market leader just to rest on your laurels, because that's how the competition gets taken out. Look at Intel, for example. Need I say more? And I do agree with Joe regarding what he said towards the end of the interview when he recommended that people who want to be their own boss and CEO of their own company should watch this interview in order to gain insight, as well as bear witness to what CEOs go through during the growing pains of starting a company. Although I wouldn't consider Jensen a genius in the intellectual sense, I would say he is more of a visionary who has a keen sense of vision with an above-average perspicacity when it comes to anticipating and creating technological trends while tracking where they're headed and recognizing phases by identifying voids in the market and turning them into profit centers and wealth generators.
You know, listen, it's strange to be an immigrant one day going to Oneida Baptist Institute with the students that were there. It's very humbling. And I'm very grateful.
Jensen's humble beginnings origin story not only led him to become assertive in his leadership, but what caused NVIDIA to turn into the technological juggernaut that it is today. Jensen was very careful, considerate, and methodical about the answers he gave to not present an opportunity for things to be taken out of context or for him to say something premature which may not look good optically. Not gonna lie, a lot of modern day graphic rendering techniques and technologies being used today, NVIDIA has had their hand in their adoption, popularity, as well as the process regarding how it's being developed today by the industry, whether it be SOI, Hairworks, CUDA, GPUs, programmable shaders, or RTX aka ray tracing, just to name a few. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts and impressions regarding this interview, all compiled into a concise, well put together summary. So, as I wrap up this video, feel free to let me know in the comments, what were your thoughts about the presentation I gave? If you're interested in this type of content as it relates to the allure surrounding tech CEOs and their impact on society, hit the subscribe button down below and click the bell icon to turn on all your notifications so you don't miss a thing. And also, if you made it this far into the video, I want to sincerely thank you for watching. So until next time, like, comment, subscribe, and share. Again, this is Frank Muller signing out. Holla at me.